Hey there, welcome to Pregame. This is The Interview, and I'm Ciara Pressler, your Pregame founder and interview host. And this is where I bring you some of my favorite creators, innovators, game changers, and we can dive into what they do, why they do it, and how they got there. And today, for our season finale, I am very honored to welcome my friend Natalia Mehlman Petrzela. She is a historian of contemporary American politics and culture and is currently writing a book on American fitness culture. She's the author of Classroom Wars, Language, Sex, and the Making of Modern Political Culture, co-host of the Past Present podcast, a frequent media guest expert, speaker at universities and conferences, and contributor to national and local media. Natalia is a co-founder of a wellness education program called Health Class 2.0 and a premier Intensati leader. And she holds a BA from Columbia and a master's and a PhD from Stanford and is based in New York City. So I met Natalia, about 10 years ago when she was a fitness instructor at Equinox, an upscale and hardcore big city gym empire where giving your workout 110% is considered average. This was around the time extreme mud races and juice cleanses were coming into vogue, but long after Bikini Body became a spring necessity and before the Soul Cycle boutique fitness explosion. I was shocked to learn that this fitness personality was also an academic, which was my bias, but we became friends and I had the privilege of helping her build her website and brand and have just watched her continue to rise and grow in her career. So this is Natalia's second talk at Pregame, although this time virtually. Welcome, Natalia.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here, Ciara. And it's so funny you say that because the first time I came to Pregame when we could like actually be together and it was cold out and I saw the skirt I wore that day in my closet and I was like, remember real life? Remember when I could travel across the country? But I'm really happy to be here with you virtually.
And we went to dinner afterwards down the street. Remember when restaurants were a place you went?
I know. There was even a bowl of nuts where like people would like reach in. Now that makes your skin crawl if it didn't already.
Yeah, it seems so dangerous. Some of the things we'll probably never do again. So. For sure. Yes, that was recent American history. Tell me a little bit about how it's been for you in this COVID world the last 3 months.
You know, it's been, I feel enormously privileged to have been healthy for the most part, and also to have myself and my husband have kind of flexible enough jobs that we've been working from home. Our children have adapted relatively well to online learning. But at the same time, you know, it's very disruptive for everybody in different ways. So it's been challenging, but I think every day about how much more serious challenges a lot of people are facing. And I think that kind of, you know, tempers some of my own discomfort with the disruptions to my life.
Yeah, we're both really lucky. I think when you are able to do your job remotely, that's already getting out ahead of a lot of what's been happening with the economic fallout as well.
For sure.
Yeah. What are you working on this summer as you go into a new chapter? I mean, you know, as school's out, both for you and for the kids. So what is your summer all about?
Two things. So the one project that's been really hard to just keep momentum on is writing my book. So I am writing as much as I can this book about fitness culture in the US, how working out became a national obsession, but also not democratically available to everybody, even as we think it's more important. So a lot of writing. And then I'm also launching a new podcast, which the trailer just dropped for this week. And so I've been doing a lot of recording on that. And that is the story of the Chippendales, the male exotic dancers, as a lens on recent American history. And it has got all the great themes: gender, sexuality, capitalism, nightlife, pop culture, and there's a murder storyline in it too. So strippers, murders, cultural analysis. I got it all for you.
Whoa, okay, plug it right now. Where can we subscribe? How can we get to this?
Go wherever you listen to your podcast, go on Spotify or go on Apple, search Welcome to Your Fantasy, which is the name of the podcast, and subscribe. And you can get right now a 3.5-minute trailer, and then episode 1 drops August 11th. There'll be 8 episodes, 1 weekly, but definitely go subscribe. And the trailer is really good and funny. So I hope you listen to it.
How did you land on this topic? I mean, I know that you specialize in recent American history, but I think of Chippendales and I think of something that needs a visual aid versus podcast.
I know. Well, we will have a great Instagram account that goes with it, but it's funny that you say that. So in some ways, like, how wouldn't I land on this topic? It's recent US history, it's masculinity, it's like the normalization of the worked out, like fitness body, it's the commodification of women's empowerment, it's LA. I wrote a book about California. It started in LA. It's actually founded by an Indian immigrant. So it's got like this whole immigration, like up by your bootstrap story that goes with it. So it's all the themes I've kind of always studied in my work. But I also, if you had told me a year and a half ago, I'd be working on a podcast about the Chippendales, or 2 years ago, I'd be surprised. I had actually been asked by a European filmmaker to give some comments on 1980s sexual culture. And I said, sure, you know, what specifically about? She was like, oh, well, we have a part of this series we're doing on the Chippendales dancers. And I was like, okay. And I remembered them. I was a New Kids on the Block fan. And I remembered going to Spencer's Gifts in the mall, and I'd go for like the New Kids buttons, and then there'd be like calendars and mugs of these guys in cuffs and collars that I like wasn't supposed to look at as like a 12-year-old. That was my only association. But I just started kind of diving into the historical newspapers and saw like, this is a really interesting story. Like, feminists were fighting about like, is Chippendales empowering or not? There was this whole murder case that went on. And I posted a few screenshots of those newspaper stories in Instagram, and someone was like, you need to pitch it as a podcast. And so I did. And long story short, we are like over a year later, and, you know, multiple trips to LA, 60 interviews. Like, it's a very deeply researched podcast, and I hope people will like it.
Wow, I'm there for it. I'm here for it. Anything I can do to support that form of feminism, yeah. I'm all about. Speaking of not being able to predict, you are the co-host of one of my favorite podcasts called Past Present, and the tagline is turning hindsight into foresight. And of course, with the unbelievable, extraordinary, and few could have predicted 2020 that we have had so far, I don't even know where to begin, but you know, people say history repeats itself, or maybe it echoes. Could we have foreseen these things coming, the events of 2020 that have dominated the news cycle?
Well, I don't know about foreseeing them coming, but definitely, I don't think anybody probably could have foreseen everything converging in the way that it has, right? This global pandemic, poor preparation for it, massive unrest over civil rights, all of that coming together in this really explosive way. I don't think that particular cocktail of political culture could have been predicted. But when you think about each of these events, yeah, each of them could have been not only planned for, if not perfectly predicted, but probably mitigated and avoided, right? It's not a foregone conclusion that the bulk of the pandemic team was fired from the federal government, right? Like during Trump's presidency, there's no rule that says police brutality that targets African-American people is the way history had to go. And so I think that I never think anyone can predict anything perfectly. I don't care if you're a historian or a trend forecaster or whatever, or a futurist, but I do think when we think about where we are right now, it's so clear that there are multiple steps that could have been taken by individuals, by institutions, that would have us in a very different place today.
Yeah, I mean, we're recording this at the end of June, which I think it's important to specify as much as we want to have evergreen content, but you know, we only know what we know today. And I was shocked to read in the New York Times this morning that the coronavirus task force is reconvening today for the first time since April 27th. That's 2 months ago.
I know. I mean, I'm not surprised because of I don't want to turn this into just a bash Donald Trump kind of presidency.
Bash away.
The other thing going on right now is, of course, Trump saying, well, you know we have all these cases because we're testing, as if testing causes cases and they wouldn't be there if we weren't testing. But no, the testing's helping you identify what's already there and, you know, hopefully get a treatment plan. But it doesn't surprise me at all that Trump, who first totally ignored the virus, now is still kind of ignoring the virus, but has long said, you know, kind of tried to mitigate like how bad it is. Remember when he was saying, I want to see church pews packed for Easter, like that. I mean, Easter, right? Here we are at the end of June and we're having surges still. I think that it's actually, I know what you mean about evergreen content, but I think there's something so valuable about capturing the reflections and the kind of contingency that we're feeling right now of not quite knowing where things are going to go, and also still being shocked. Like the fact that you read that in the New York Times and you're like, how have they not convened since April? And we're like, oh my God, about that. Think about how much has been normalized in the last years that we're not even like about, oh my God, Trump lied about another business dealings, not even newsworthy. Like, of course he lied. Oh, the Russians interfered. Yeah, should I even read that? I kind of know that happens. Remember when those things blew our mind? You know, so I think it's, you know, Masha Gasson, who writes in the New Yorker, talks and has written a lot about like totalitarianism. I remember in 2016, she was saying one of the really important things when you have a kind of regime change is for people to write down the things they're feeling and that are happening day to day, because otherwise, this is so morbid, but it's like a frog boiling in water, that like you don't actually realize the way things are changing around you unless you kind of record how that normalization is happening. So that's what we're doing right now by talking.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Well, you know, something I've been thinking about a lot, and this is, you know, in my dream fantasy world where we have unlimited time to do projects, you and I co-write this book on the element of wellness culture, which is, you know, the positive thinking movement, you know, and it's not talked about very often. It was talked about in the Dream podcast, which I really appreciated, but, you know, Donald Trump was studying Norman Vincent Peale and the power of positive thinking and going to Marble Collegiate Church in Manhattan. And so much of what I think has enabled some of this moment, including the spread of COVID, is this idea that, oh, if I just think positively, I won't get a disease, you know, and it goes along with maybe in the Christian tradition, like, oh, God will protect me, which none of this proves to be true because we all die at some point, but including, you know, some of the central figures here. But I hear a lot of like relativism of the facts of, you know, oh, you just do you do what's comfortable, versus like, no, my actions affect you. It's not just my truth or your truth. There are facts about what COVID is, how COVID spreads, and what we can do to be safer. It's not just personal choice. It's not just positive thinking.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to so many important and problematic strands in our world right now. And I think, you know, to stick with this COVID case and like the popularity or the appeal of this kind of anti-science thinking, I think what's really interesting, as your comments kind of suggested, is that you see that coming out of like right-wing Trump supporters who are like, don't listen to those pointy-headed intellectuals, like, listen to me, that's just fake news, and kind of scrambling the signals of what's an authority or not. But then you also have like this wellness culture, which is totally a different aesthetic, you know, which is like, oh, just the universe has my back. Like,
Yes.
you know, just sort of breathe, take this supplement, like, you know, Western medicine and vaccines. And there's a lot of intersection between those two worldviews. There's actually a new podcast, which is really interesting, that takes those on together. It's called Conspirituality.
Oh,
Yes,
spirituality.
Yeah, I went, full disclosure, I went on it last week or a couple weeks ago, but that's actually, you might remember, do you remember Derek Barris from Equinox, who taught yoga there? Then he moved out to LA.
Oh, yeah, okay.
He's one of the hosts, and then the other one is this guy, Matthew Remski, who's been one of the guys who sort of like exposed a lot of the sexual trauma in the yoga world, and he has a lot of experience writing about cults. And I think that, Ciara, to your point, like they really highlight, I think they say like we're right-wing conspiracy thinking meets like left-wing wellness utopianism, and I think that COVID is really like a place where those come together. And the other thing you said, which I think is super important and also has an appeal across a lot of different subcultures, is that just this like highly individualistic way of seeing the world and seeing health, for example. And that is something, I mean, I like to think of myself as someone who's like more attuned to the collective than the normal self-involved person. But I gotta say, I don't know how you felt about it, but it was really jarring for me during this whole quarantine that this thing I always thought was sort of like virtuous and good, exercising, going to the gym, going for a run, was all of a sudden a mark of selfishness, because if you're out there as a spreader, like that's a bigger problem for health than not going to the gym. And let me tell you, I had to like really like slap my hand from not going to the gym until the last possible minute, because it's a big shift to go from like what's best for me health wise to the more collective idea of public health. And I think we're being forced to think about that in a way that we just really have not in our recent history.
Well, no, American culture is founded on individualism and thrives on it. And, you know, I hang out in the startup world, and the folklore is always of this like individual, always young white male, cis male, heterosexual founder sitting in his garage in a hoodie, like coming up with an idea, you know, the social network kind of image.
Totally.
And all in a vacuum. And, you know, we ignore so much the ecosystem of success and the circumstances around success, which, you know, my selfish hope at the beginning of COVID was, you know, sitting around pointing out like, you know, the CEO of doTERRA Oils is not in the coronavirus task force. And also like our actions affect each other, and can we get a return to actual expertise? You know, just because someone appoints themselves an expert on the internet doesn't actually mean they're an expert in anything. And so I'm hoping these could be some of the positive side effects of what we're going through right now.
I hope that that happens. I really, really do. That's definitely one potential path forward, I think. Have this like renewed embrace of sort of science and like, you know, justified expertise. I do worry though that at the same time, like our institutions right now are failing us so dramatically that it might actually sort of give more strength to that anti-institutional impulse, which is like, well, the schools can't even figure out how to open on time. Like the CDC doesn't have its shit together. Like, you know, and so I do think, I hope what you're saying happens. I really, really do. So.
Well, you know, you can carry that forward into the civil rights movement that's happening right now is, you know, if you exist in a system that is designed to hold you down, what chance do you have? It's not just pick yourself up by the bootstraps. And we are seeing that, you know, certain sides are digging in even harder to what they thought before, or to what they need to believe in order to keep going without guilt in their own lives, you know, or to absolve themselves from having to worry about the structures of racism. But again, ecosystem, right?
I know. I do think maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong, but I am a little bit more optimistic on the kind of civil rights front, that I feel like, you know, ideas like structural inequality or systemic racism, which, you know, these were things that like you talk about in a graduate seminar room and you don't really think are going to filter into mainstream discourse, much less become like almost the dominant discourse of the way a lot of people are talking about inequality. Like that feels like a surprise to me. Like, you know, we could have a whole other podcast like unpacking the corporate statements around like BLM and like happen, because there's a lot to unpack there. But like 5 years ago, or no, not 5 years ago, it's too long, 2 years ago, 1 year ago, 6 months ago, for most corporations to make a Black Lives Matter solidarity statement would have been one, strange, two, kind of suicidal from a brand perspective. That's so radical. Why would you ally yourself with this? And now, you know, people are getting slammed. Yes, for that. I don't want to overstate the cultural shift, but they're getting slammed for saying things that people used to say all the time, like, I don't see race, or like, you know what I mean? Or we believe in the power of each person to, you know, lift themselves up. And now I think there's a greater awareness that like, no, that's not okay. And that kind of anti-racism and an awareness of structural inequality is becoming more a part of our conversation. It has a lot more currency. And so I'm optimistic that's a good thing.
Yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic. I think, you know, I always have hope for a better future, but, you know, we've had these conversations many times throughout American history, and our attention spans are shorter than ever. So who's to say that something else won't happen in a week or a month, and, you know, some people, Black people, will be left holding the bag. And
I think that's absolutely right. And I don't want to overstate my optimism. I mean, I had a pretty depressing conversation with someone a couple of days ago who works on some of these corporate statements and said that there were plenty of people he's talked to who are like, okay, just like figure out what we're supposed to say, wait for someone else to say it first. We don't want to be first. And then we'll put out our statement saying whatever we're supposed to say. And like, I guess it's progress that like what you're supposed to say is now a more daring assertion of solidarity than it was recently. But you're totally right. That's a very hollow kind of progress.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, as a business coach and consultant, I'm seeing a little bit of what's happening behind the scenes of, you know, we all see the statements, but the internal work to actually improve, it takes time.
Yeah.
And no one should expect results overnight. It's very easy as an Instagram follower to like call people out. And I do believe in calling people out when they say they're going to do something and they don't do it, businesses specifically. Yeah. But, you know, we want to transform our executive leadership so that it's more diverse. I mean, that's going to take years, but I think it's up to us as the shoppers to check back in 3 months or 3 years and say, like, here's what you said you were going to do. Did you do it? Yeah. And then stop shopping there.
That's exactly right. And I think that consumer activism is often poo-pooed. It's just like, oh, you know, that's not going to really change anything. And it's not the whole picture. But I do think that, I mean, like a lot of these consumer brands, they serve consumers. And so that those voices actually matter. So yeah, I think that that's exactly right. Even when it's the products you really like, right? I'm sure we've all had, you know, brands that we love to patronize do less than you know, unsavory things and make the decision to cut those ties or not to, right? And I think I think those questions are becoming more to the forefront. Actually, even before the protests over George Floyd's murder, not just George Floyd, you know, Ahmaud Arbery, so many people. But I think during COVID, like a lot of people were sort of reassessing some of the ways that they were spending their money, both out of economic need, because so many people had their incomes kind of slashed, but also I think, you know, there was a real attention to how businesses were responding and how they were putting into practice safety protocols. And I mean, I talked to a lot of people who were like, I'm just not gonna spend my money at this place anymore because I don't respect it or I don't need it anymore. And those two things can go hand in hand.
Yeah, you know, I've been struggling particularly with two massive global brands that I am a regular customer of, and one is my bank. And, you know, I've known for years that it had its foundations and was originally able to, you know, grow because of its investment in slavery. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I should move my money. And you just don't, you know, like that's part of human psychology. It's like, oh, I'll do it tomorrow, or I'll start researching that, you know, and like it's on me to do that if that's my value. Or the other one, of course, is Amazon. You know, if I'm buying these books by Black authors, I would like to buy them from Black bookstores. But those bookstores, you can't expect the same level of service from Black bookstores of getting a 2-day shipping, because it requires, you know, to be able to offer 2-day shipping requires that you have factory conditions also that may not, you know, I have a family member who was working at Amazon during COVID, and you know, I don't want my money going towards those work conditions. Yeah, I think also when we find out who got some of the money from the government over the last 3 months and who didn't, you know, with some of the backlash over brands that got PPP that was supposed to be meant for small businesses, I'm really glad that there was pushback on that.
Yeah, well, I think one of these things that factors into our consumer choices is exactly what you're saying, that actually making these choices means giving something up, right? And that's something that in our culture of affluence and sort of like ever-growing materialism, we're not really used to. Like, why shouldn't that show up on my doorstep tomorrow? You know, and I think actually that's something really powerful that's been exposed. I mean, people have known this for a long time, but it's been exposed by COVID, the kind of factory and labor conditions that go into what feels like this instant gratification economy. And it really highlighted the people who are, like you're saying, delivering Amazon packages, fulfilling Amazon shipments, driving the postal trucks. And also, I mean, we did a segment on Past Present about the meatpacking industry, so I read a considerable amount of that. But like, you know, we take for granted in the US that the meat refrigerator is going to be like full, and then everybody has a freezer with like 10 meals in it or more that they could make. And like, look at the cost, the human cost of what it takes to produce that. There's this great book by a guy named Josh Specht called, I think it's like Red Meat America. It's like something like that. Josh Specht is the author, but it's about the beef industry. And he comes to a conclusion that basically our culture has to decide, like, beef can't, like, we just can't get meat at these prices and in these quantities if we value humanity enough to have humane working conditions. Like, they just don't go together, you know? And he has a really interesting protest that he talks about in that book from like almost 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, where he talks about there were issues with beef quality, and women show up at the butcher and they're complaining. There were problems with like beef supply. They're complaining about the price and like not getting their meat on time, not the working conditions, right? And he's like, that is so American to frame protest as like why I'm not getting my product the way I want it, as opposed to thinking of the larger system that produces it. And I do think COVID and like just the material goods economy during that period has hopefully put some more attention on that.
You know, I've been playing this game in my head, and I'm curious what your take is on it. It feels too early to play it, but I think it's fun, which is, what were the perfect conditions that had to converge for America, or white left-leaning America, to get really mobilized around Black Lives Matter? And I'm thinking, like, it's got to be some perfect storm of the video, the crime that George Floyd was supposed to be, why the cops responded, that we've been pent up indoors for 2 months, that it was summertime so you could go out and protest and the nights were longer. You know, like, why now? Do you have any take on why now?
I think all of those things are spot on. I think that the intensity and the flagrancy of the George Floyd video, and I hate that I have watched that now multiple times, and that I've seen so many other versions of Black people being killed on camera. Like, is that even something we can, how is that a normal part of our media landscape? Or not normal, but it is. There was something about that particular video, I think, which was even more in your face than some of the other ones. It was so obvious. And also the officer, Derek Chauvin, I'm not sure how you say his name, it was so performative, the way he committed that murder. I mean, it was, I'm not a lawyer, but it was so clear that he wasn't in danger. It was just so obvious. And so I think there's that. Yeah, I'm kind of repeating what you're saying. There's the being pent up. There's the multiple years of Trump. You know, I think that is kind of simmering below the surface. There is the fact that everybody was not only inside, but also on screen. So being connected and watching these videos and being sort of like amped up in that particular way. Yeah, the season, I mean, it was all of it, really. And then I also think, you know, the fact that so many stores were closed and that so many cities already had this otherworldly feel about them, I think that kind of, I don't want to say gave license to, but gave license a little bit to this kind of abnormal behavior, kind of subversion of normal behaviors that you would see on the city streets.
Yeah, you've got a bunch of people who are young and unemployed. You know, they've got plenty of time to protest, and they're already mad at the system because they're being affected by the system.
Yeah.
You've got stores that are closed, so maybe law enforcement or the powers that be aren't as concerned about keeping people out of the streets because it's not really blocking traffic if people aren't really commuting.
Yeah.
So some of those circumstances maybe as well. The other game I've been playing, you know, is how could we, you know, at some point, could people mobilize on this level for feminism? You know, could we go loot all the tampons, you know? And I just think it could never look like this for feminism, because it's just such a different type. There's too much disagreement among women of what equality looks like.
Yeah, yes, I think that's probably like one of the, and not to, I mean, all Black people certainly don't agree on the path forward, right?
Right.
Like I don't want to in any way paint too broad a brush. But there's something about the murder on video of a Black man that's mobilizing in a pretty coherent way that
Mhm.
I think you're right. I mean, I hope we don't start murdering women because they're women in the streets in the same way. I hope that's not what's coming down the pipeline or what's needed. But I think that you're right, that save for something that flagrant, it's harder to mobilize because we've seen in very recent history that many women, like anybody, don't necessarily identify, particularly in their activist roles, as women foremost. I mean, look at the shameful numbers of white women voting for Trump in
Yeah.
2016. Most people would say that those women were either privileging their whiteness over their womanhood, or I think this is a more complex reading, and I think it gets to your earlier point that women conceive of equality and advancement in different ways, that barring true opportunities for advancement for a lot of women to be breadwinners, to go to school, to have, control over their own reproductive future, that a lot of women think their best bet in life is to be attached to a man who can take care of them. And so in that sense, not that Trump is like a pro-family candidate for many, many reasons, but he was promoting with this Make America Great Again, a very traditional idea of family values that I can definitely see some women who think, wow, wouldn't the best thing in the world be to be married like to a guy like Donald Trump, a rich guy who takes care of me, And
Yeah, absolutely.
that makes me want to vomit personally, but I don't think that's a completely wild idea, particularly for a lot of women who are right in realizing they have a lot of roadblocks in their way to advancement, in their own right.
Yeah. Well, speaking of women's advancement, this is an awkward transition. I wanted to bring it back to the wellness industry where a lot of women are in leadership. And we talked about your book when you were at the beginning of researching it, and I'd love to hear how it's taking shape, particularly around the business of wellness and fitness.
Yeah, so it's been really interesting and so much has happened. But so basically the main arc of the book, it's a story about how America became obsessed with exercise and came to hold exercise up as like a virtuous pursuit. Which itself is a big story, but that the way that those ideas and practices and products have been disseminated is almost entirely through a private industry. So that even as we have become a culture where exercise is seen as more and more important to being a full self, we have not made any provisions for public access to exercise. If anything, cuts in physical education, cuts in recreational, like basketball courts, swimming pools, running trails, or a very unequal provision of them. Like there are places where you actually see big, influxes of budget into these things, but it's like, in the place where all the bankers and the lawyers live, there's like a new running trail. Then you go up to a neighborhood which is mostly Black or brown, and it's, not safe at all to be running in the streets. And so that's kind of the story that I'm telling in there. And so part of what I'm doing, you asked about the business perspective, I like to think it's not just this pure kind of like anti-capitalist, like, oh, neoliberalism and the industry rose and like killed everything. I actually think the way these fitness businesses have grown is fascinating in its own right, in terms of the way that they're promoting fitness as part of living a full life and living a good life. And that's changed a lot over the years. I mean, just to give you like a few little like snippets, I mean, you have like, so the book, I really start in the 19th century and I go up until the present, but like you have like a woman, her name was Abby Stockton, but she was known as Pudgy, was a childhood nickname. She was in the 1930s, a switchboard operator in Southern California, and she starts going over to Muscle Beach, and she starts learning like to do the acrobatics. And then during World War II, she and her husband, who was a lifter at Muscle Beach, they go up to a base in Northern California, Victorville, and which now is in the news for very bad reasons, Victorville, but and she learns to lift weights in the backyard, and she becomes like the foremost promoter of strength training for women in a moment when women exercising at all is completely strange. And even weightlifting is seen as this like gross thing that like men who are like meatheads or maybe gay do. And so the way that she promotes this idea of weightlifting for women in like the 1940s is really, really interesting. Like her gym is called the Salon of Figure Development, right? And she talks about how beneath every lovely curve lies a muscle, and like she has like weight racks, but she has it decorated like a living room because it's supposed to be this domestic luxury place where women would feel like they are appropriately ladylike, but they're also lifting weights. And so like, to me, that's not just a story of like, oh, it was a business, it was private, like that's all we need to know. I'm like, no, the way that people conceived of the product they were offering is a fascinating lens on understanding the way people were relating to their bodies and to their money. And so that's just like one example from the early days. But I dive into a lot of different businesses to kind of look at the way they were promoting a particular kind of body and a particular kind of body and aesthetic.
Yeah, I mean, you really came down hard a few years ago, rightly so, on this idea of like a beach body or a bikini body, right?
Yeah, right.
And different body types have certainly been more in over time. I'm curious what trends now that you find interesting in fitness, or anyone you think who's really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been like even since in the couple of years since we've talked, yes, there's been, I think, like a pretty big move away, at least among sort of forward-thinking people in fitness, from bikini body and talking about like skinny as the new as what you're aspiring to. I think actually some of the folks on social media who are like unapologetically fat, or have been fat and are not pitching themselves as like having gone through their transformation journey and now being their real selves, but talking about not just body positivity, but body neutrality, right? I think that's a really interesting new direction. And just for whoever's listening to this who might not realize that, a few years ago, body positivity was like the woke thing, like, loving your body, even if you're not a size 2. A lot of people have been now emphasizing the fact that like that model of body positivity almost sometimes can put a new pressure on people, like, oh, you don't love your body, like what's wrong with you, like, oh, you must not be so connected to your like authentic self. And it's like, oh my god, I like got over wanting to be skinny all the time and I don't quite love my body yet. Am I a failure in a different way? And so this idea of body neutrality kind of actually disconnects our notion of like emotional self-worth or of moral value to how we feel about our body. And I think that's a really interesting direction. And I am in some ways a little skeptical, because I actually think the idea of like the mind and the body and the self and the being all connected is really powerful, and how I feel about my body. Like, I think it's a good thing that it's sort of connected to the rest of my selfhood. But I think that is very powerful, because when I think about losing 5 pounds or gaining 5 pounds, particularly as a woman, it feels like a radical act to be like, okay, so I gained 5 pounds. Those are 5 pounds that I like can figure out what I need to do to get rid of them, or I can keep them, or maybe I'll gain 5 more, and not connecting to that. It's like, oh shit, I've been so bad,
Right.
Like,
moral judgment.
Yeah, and like the sort of like panic spiral, and like that, to me, I in that way I can really get behind this idea of body neutrality as something really kind of valuable, that I think the fitness industry is maybe starting to embrace a little bit.
Are there any fitness businesses or personalities that you find interesting right now, in this historical context?
People should go follow Nikki Pebbles, Nikki. She is really interesting. She's worked for a bunch of different brands. She's someone who was larger before and actually lost a bunch of weight. And she talks a lot on Instagram. Like, she's got this like crazy red hair. She's really interesting. But she talks a lot about like what it means to lose weight, but like I was saying before, not connect that to like, oh, this is your transformation from like failure to like fabulous. But also, how sometimes people can think she sort of sold out by losing weight. Like, I thought you were body positive. So she's really kind of smart and talking about a lot of this stuff. So I would follow her.
Do you think that the fitness industry has, or where do you think it falls, the ethical responsibility in selling? You know, everybody wants to have the latest thing and the new thing, and we do this kind of workout. Where is the ethical?
I mean, I do, for all my talk about the interesting work all these businesses are doing, I mean, I think that a profit motive kind of corrupts, and the fitness industry has been a place where that is very, very apparent, in part because there hasn't been a ton of regulation on it. Like we were talking about expertise earlier on, the fact that you can be a fitness influencer with, you know, thousands of followers and put exercises out there, or supplements, or weird teas, or like corsets, and because you can make money on it, that becomes a kind of self-fulfilling idea that like, well, if people are buying it, it must be good, or it must be worthwhile. Like that's profoundly screwed up. And I think that that comes, like I said before, in some ways from not just a lack of government regulation, although there is that, but also from a lack of professional norms, or kind of notions of what expertise is required to work in fitness. You know, historians always think about like, is there a progress narrative or a declension narrative, or like are things getting better or worse? I think humans just think that way. And like with fitness, it's really interesting because like on the one hand, certainly since like the 1980s, even since the 1950s, you've had this huge growth in research, and you've had this huge growth in like university programs. You can be an exercise physiologist, a kinesiologist, et cetera. But I would not say, and certifications too, I would not necessarily say that growth in knowledge has translated into a kind of more rigorous set of norms for the industry as a whole. If anything, I think recently, like social media has created like powerful voices that are not necessarily undergirded with that kind of like, you know, apparatus of expertise. And some are, don't get me wrong. And you can see like there's this guy, Pete McCall, who is like an educator for a lot of brands and shares a lot of things on social media, writes for a lot of the professional organizations. Like he's someone who has done his homework and has all these degrees and really knows, and you see when he talks. But like, let's imagine if he didn't have that, but he had 1 million followers, like he'd probably actually even be more powerful, you know? And so it's, that to me is like really, really troubling.
Yeah, I was watching for the first time Goop Lab last night, you know, which everyone has an opinion about Goop. But, you know, I keep hearing from my more cutting edge friends, everyone's about Wim Hof. And so this was my first time really being aware of Wim Hof. And, you know, I was thinking like, you know, I was like, I want this, I better learn this, you know, but at the same time, that skeptical side of me that has done enough research around, you could call it influencer, you could call it cult leader, but just, you know, I'm like, there's nothing wrong with anything that he's doing, and yet the way he is about it is exactly the same way as like cult leaders of the 20th century.
Right. Well, look, there's nothing wrong with being inspired. And I'm like, you know, sanguine enough to think we should all seek out inspiration to how we want to live our lives and how we want to treat our bodies. I just think we should also, there are a lot of people who know that we are like hardwired to seek inspiration and don't always treat that impulse, I think, in the most responsible way. And so I think and there's no apparatus around the wellness industry that is preventing the bad actors from getting themselves out there as loudly, or if not more loudly than good ones. So I think, I mean, I've like said this in a lot of different venues, like I love a lot of this stuff and I do it myself, and I teach Intensati. It's how we met, teaching this like wacky fitness class with positive affirmations that like theoretically rewires your brain, but I'm not that kind of PhD. Do I know if that's really true or not? I don't know. It makes me feel good, you know? And I think that like, it's like, I thought a lot about this because I was so deeply in that Intensati community for a while. Like, I think we should seek things that make us feel good, but we should also think about like at what cost, right? Or like, how much am I investing in something, maybe financially, but also like emotionally myself? How much am I investing in something? And like, what do I know about this thing really? Like, do I really know it works? Like, do I, you know, am I putting myself in harm? Because that's of course something else. There was this I'm like, feel like I'm plugging a million podcasts. I was on the BBC last week, I guess, talking about the politics of wellness historically. And there was one guy in there who's like a CBD entrepreneur in Britain. And he talked about how like CBD oil, CBD products changed his life. He felt so good about them. So he started, I think, selling them. I hope I'm not getting the story wrong, but people then would show up and he really believed they made his life better. But he's like really sick people were showing up, really sick people. And he's like, that like sort of made me realize like, you know, is it up to me to have to draw this line? Like, who am I to be like, oh, you're like well enough to take this thing to feel good, but no, I'm actually being manipulative by giving you something to make you feel good if you really need, you know, a kind of real medical treatment. And I think that's something to think about too, you know. I could share a lot of anecdotes about that dynamic, but it is like we all want to feel better, but like, are you so invested in this sort of untested way of feeling better that you're actually like, you know, not getting vaccinated or not getting chemo? I know people in all those camps, you know, and in the name of wellness, like it's a problem.
Well, let's leave it on that cliffhanger. But I'm curious, what is keeping you well? What is keeping you inspired these days?
Well, I have just recovered from a massive stress fracture in my femur. So that I like basically couldn't do anything for 10 weeks. So I am so grateful to like go for a hike or a walk. But I will say, I hate working out at home, but quarantine has changed me. I bought a Peloton. This is not Peloton. I know. I didn't own so much as a one resistance band at home, but I am really happy by owning that product. Like I love going to gyms, but I was like, I'm not going to a sweaty spin studio anytime soon, even when unfortunately, so many businesses are going to suffer because of that. But this is pretty great. I have had very limited childcare, so I can like preheat the oven for dinner, do like a 20-minute class, literally walk 2 feet, hopefully don't sweat on the food. Sorry. Yeah, that's been really, really vital for me, but also just being outside. I'm in Long Island right now. And so hiking and walking, and I can't run yet, but that was really great before I got injured too.
Yeah, you know, my favorite luxury to spend on is a really nice gym membership. And of course I canceled that. And I have discovered walks within walking distance of my home that I never knew existed. And, you know, I live in Oregon, so it's just an embarrassment of riches when it comes to nature. And I'm here for it. We'll see what happens in the winter, but I'm grateful for it. And I think it'll be something that stays with me for the rest of my life.
Totally. I hope so.
Well, Natalia, where can we find you, follow you, stay up to date?
Really, Twitter and Instagram are the best places. At Natalia Petrzela, I will spell it because it's awkward. Natalia Petrzela. I'm there on both places, sharing kind of different things in both places, but I think both are of value.
All right, and your website, and we will definitely subscribe to those podcasts as well.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Natalia. Have a great weekend.
I spit it cold like lyrically I'm a problem. That's when the show starts. I get it, live it, I did it.